Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Stephen Rubenstein, the chair of ABNY, and on behalf of Melvin Miller, our great CEO, and me, I want to say welcome today. Our ABNY community has always believed in the power of meaningful conversations, of listening, and then together seeking long-term, fair and equitable solutions to our city's most significant issues. It is the reason we are so grateful to host with John Jay College this important conversation today on the Future of Public Safety Report, a new study conducted by John Jay and the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. The report was developed to inform and help reimagine the future of public safety and the role of policing. This type of research is desperately needed, and we at ABNY so appreciate the hard work that went into the report. And I want to say thank you to our esteemed and incredibly accomplished panelists today for their time, for their wisdom, for their civic commitment, and really their commitment to these critical issues that are so important for all of us and for our city. Here to kick off this discussion is one of ABNY's newest board members and the first Latinx and minority educator to be the chancellor in CUNY's history, Felix Matos Rodriguez. We all know the chancellor well, so I won't go long into an introduction. I do want to say one thing about him. Whatever he has done, he has had a profound impact. As the president of CUNY's Eugenio Maria de Hostos Community College, he engineered a double-digit increase in the school's retention rate. He later helped propel Queens College to the highest echelon in college social mobility rankings. And now as chancellor, he is leading, driving, and enhancing a system that is doing critical work of equipping and empowering New Yorkers of all backgrounds to achieve positive personal trajectories and upward mobility. New York is a better, more inclusive and equitable city because of his vision, his leadership, and his humanity. It is now my pleasure and honor to turn the Zoom over to the Chancellor.
Buenos dias. It is great to be with everyone today to continue discussions on the future of public safety and the steps we must take to achieve a more equitable, just, and racially neutral system of public safety and policing. I want to thank the Association for a Better New York, ABNY, and John Jay College for graciously hosting this conversation. ABNY shares many of the ideals that CUNY embodies and fosters, so we are pleased to work with them to make New York a more inclusive and equitable place to live. I was recently honored to be appointed to the ABNY board. I look forward to sharing our ideas, resources, and skills to benefit New Yorkers, particularly as we rebound from this pandemic, and to advance discussions on racial and social justice. I want to thank two good friends, ABNY Chairman Stephen Rubenstein and the CEO, Melvin Miller, a proud John Jay alumni and a three-time CUNY graduate, for welcoming here today. I also want to commend the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives for partnering with John Jay on the Future of Public Safety discussions series, which led to the production of this critical report. As the country's preeminent institution of higher learning and preparation of law enforcement leaders who are also fierce advocates for racial and social justice, it makes sense that John Jay will be at the forefront of a discussion on the reimagining of policing in our country. The seeds of John Jay were planted in the shadows of the civil rights movement in the late 50s. Concerns regarding the relationship between the police and the community and the broader educational objectives in criminal justice fostered the conditions for John Jay's evolution and establishment back in 1964. Almost 60 years later, John Jay is again standing at the nexus of another social justice movement, this one emanating from the waves of nationwide protests over police-involved killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women. I am proud that CUNY continues to develop programs and initiatives that cultivate a climate of openness and mutual respect among people of different backgrounds, where students are encouraged to question assumptions and to think critically. In reviewing the report on the future of public safety, it was illuminating to find that so many of the points of consensus that drives its recommendations mirror programs, and initiatives that CUNY prioritizes as an academic institution. Services that address food and housing insecurity and mental health, for example. The same issues that can impede student success in the classroom can also indirectly create stresses that precipitate poor interactions with law enforcement. So, while we are reducing obstacles for students across our 25 colleges, we are also, ideally, helping to alleviate trauma that could impact the relationship between communities and law enforcement. This obviously only addresses one of the many facets that animate this historically complicated relationship, which is where the report and the people behind it come in. Representing the constellation of options and bringing everyone together is John Jay's president, Carol Mason, who really is the perfect person to lead this project of reimagining public safety. Before coming to CUNY, President Mason served in the Obama administration as the U.S. Assistant Attorney General and later as the head of the Department of Justice Office of Justice Programs. Among her many responsibilities, she led the department's work to address the issue of community trust in the justice system through a variety of programs, including the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, a partnership that involved John Jay and other academic institutions. President Mason cares deeply about these issues on all sides of the discourse, from the point of view of people of color, including our students who have experienced incidents of police aggression, to alumni and partners in law enforcement who carry out their duties with integrity and respect. The report is but one manifestation of her incredible commitment to achieving a more equitable and just system of policing. And she's a great partner, and nobody cares more about her students than President Mason. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend, the wonderful Carol Mason, president of John Jay College. Please join me in extending her a very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, for those remarks. And I will tell you that it is a pleasure to work with a chancellor, a boss who is equally committed to these issues and to the success of our students and the city, and understanding the role that CUNY plays in the success of New York City. And we are honored that ABNY is allowing us to partner in this conversation because of ABNY's commitment to the success of New York and the commitment to the success of everyone in New York. So let me take a step back. The Chancellor talked about how we came to have this report, but I want to give you a little more context. And I want to make sure that everyone listening knows that every single one of our panelists participated heavily in the production of this report and were engaged in it. As the Chancellor mentioned, when I was at the Department of Justice, we funded something called the National Initiative for Community to Create Trust and Justice. And we had 6 pilot sites. And our goal was to use the concepts of procedural justice, implicit bias, and racial reconciliation so that we never had another Michael Brown or Trayvon Martin situation again. And Minneapolis was one of our pilot sites. So when the George Floyd killing happened, it was a severe gut punch for me personally, because we had invested millions of dollars and years in Minneapolis to make sure something like that never happened. And what happened was beyond what we can conceive. And so all of the sworn officers there had received training in procedural justice and implicit bias, sworn and civilian, and everyone had worked with the community on racial reconciliation. So I realized that there's a whole lot more that needs to be done. And then our country, as you know, has now become so polarized around this concept of policing versus others. And I knew that that was not the right conversation we needed to have. So my vision was thinking about how do we take the conversation back to thinking about what does public safety look like? Where do we need to make investments? And what is the role of policing in this new kind of conversation? Thankfully, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives called and said, we want to partner with you and do something with you. And they came with a funder who could fund this work. So what we began was a series of conversations, and 3 of our panelists were part of that conversation. And the Commissioner Shea, his group, his organization, from his line officers to his leadership, were part of our focus group conversations where we tested out the concept. So the vision was bringing all these disparate voices together. We had police chiefs, mayors, community activists, grassroots activists, young people. We had philanthropy, we had business leaders, all engaged in a conversation to say, what does public safety look like? Because I had great confidence that if we got everyone together thinking prospectively about what does it look like and how do we get there, that we could reach consensus. And we reached 9 points of consensus. So this panel, and that to me is the beginning of the work. And the beauty of this panel and the partnership with ABNY is we're doing what we intended. Was the report is a launching point for the real work. And so everybody on this panel, they're part of the real work. So I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order and then start the conversation. And I encourage the panelists, this is a conversation. So if you want to comment on something your fellow panelists have said, speak up. So first we have the esteemed Ms. Erica Ford, who is the co-founder of Life Camp. And she has been a critical voice in helping us understand that public safety is not the sole domain of law enforcement officers. Next, we have Wes Moore, who is the leader of Robin Hood, which is an organization that we're all fortunate to hopefully benefit from, and their work in dealing with poverty in New York City, and creating a platform and a pathway for all of our communities to succeed. We next have DA Gonzalez, who is the Brooklyn District Attorney, who again has been using his platform to engage with the community differently and how he sees the role of the district attorney. And we have our police commissioner, Commissioner Shea, who again, his whole organization has been involved in our focus groups to test out these concepts. And we know that that NYPD and the whole city have been engaged in rethinking and reimagining what public safety looks like and the role of law enforcement. So let me start with a question for all of you. And this question is, give us a brief description of your current work and efforts in reimagining public safety, and how your work is shaping and redefining what public safety is. And a follow on, what would you like people to think when they hear the word public safety? So why don't we start with Erica?
My work around public safety would be putting the word public back into effect and using the community-based public safety model where credible messengers and interrupters go into the community and work with those who have the highest potential to be shot or shoot someone. At the same time, changing community norms, engaging community around the importance of taking responsibility to make peace a lifestyle, to change the response to interpersonal violence, to change how we react to trauma, to change the methodologies in which we use to help our people heal from the generational trauma to a place of healing as opposed to a place of criminalization, to allow people to learn how to show up for people. And so that when you step into the community as a server, as a humble servant, as a provider to the community, that you step from a place of compassion. You step empty of judgment, empty of comparison, empty of hate to individuals and communities. And you step up and you show people how you are there for them. And you help them from where they are to where they need to go. And in doing that, in our particular area in South Jamaica, Queens, we were able to go 4 years with no one being killed. We were able to go up to 562 days with no one being shot. We were able to reduce the number of people going back to jail after coming out on parole. We were able to reduce the number of, or increase the number of people getting therapeutic services, people engaging with lawyers and working out their situations with their families and their community, and really becoming whole in terms of their relationship to their children and their family after coming home from jail, and really rebirth to a new way of engaging and existing with the New York City Crisis Management System and Life Camp, we put community back in helping people transform and helping communities transform.
I always love hearing you speak. This is not the first nor the last time we will be engaging you in these conversations, Ms. Ford. So DA Gonzalez, you have taken up the challenge from community members to be engaged in creating safer communities. Talk to us about your work.
Good morning, President Mason. I just love saying that, President Mason. The police, prosecutors, and to all my fellow panelists, good morning and thank you for having me. We clearly play a role in helping the community feel safe. There's always going to be a role for police and prosecutors in public safety because unfortunately we have people who live in our communities who commit egregious acts of violence, and accountability and justice will require the police and prosecutors and court systems to be involved. However, as Erica said, and she said it correctly, public safety is really about the feeling that community members have living within their space. And we have to allow the community an opportunity to, and also to have the trust, by the police and by others in charge, to let the community take the lead in what public-led safety feels like in that community. So what that means in practice is that vibrant communities tend to feel safer where there's investments in education and there's businesses being developed and that people feel that they can move about in their communities, and there's resources for mental health. There's resources for all kind of issues that people have in their lives, and those issues are locally based, but then they can be resolved by community-based organizations. I think those are neighborhoods that tend to have the sense of safety. The police commissioner can tell you in Brooklyn, before last year when we saw that tremendous surge in gun violence, Brooklyn was getting safer every year in terms of the stats. 38% reduction in gun violence from 2015 to 2019, a full third fewer homicides, but the sense of public safety did not seem to move in that same direction. People didn't feel that much safer because there was a lot of the issues in the community that were unaddressed. The community did not have the ability and did not have the resources to deal with local problems. And so, for me as DA, one of the things that we're doing here in Brooklyn, and we're doing it because, the police department has been a partner in this, is allowing the community to have influence and share in the power of how these cases are resolved. So we have different programs where we send people back into the community to get resources and services within the community. These services, we hope, will mean that people move forward in their lives in productive ways, and things that Erica says, learn to resolve interpersonal problems in different ways. So there's services that we provide around substance use disorder and other kind of social services. And I think all of that is very important. It also provides jobs and resources within communities. But I think really what's particularly important about how we're doing work differently in Brooklyn is we believe that the services in the community are important, but what we're trying to do is provide connections between people who live in the community. So people like Erica having, be really involved and really invested in the lives of our young people will make a difference in having them act more responsibly and thinking in a different way because they have trusted members of their communities that are kind of looking at them, paying attention to them, and serving as a resource to them during the day. So it's services, but the big part of this is not a service provided by some institutional provider who has no connection to their neighborhood. It's connections made locally and that will grow. And I think if you think about any community, vibrant communities tend to have people in the community who are invested in their neighborhoods, and those those connections are what keep blocks together, buildings together, and ultimately will keep our communities together. And so I'm not going to filibust, but we're doing a lot of things here in Brooklyn differently. And I hope we get a chance to talk about the Brownsville Safety Alliance a little later.
Mr. Moore, please tell us, you run the largest anti-poverty organization in the nation, and we know there's a connection between poverty and the lack of public safety. Please talk to us about what you're doing in this area.
Well, first, I want to echo D.A. Gonzalez. It's very nice saying President Mason, and I will say it over and over and over again, but it's an honor to be with all of you today, because each and every one of you, frankly, are not just role models to me, but just imperative pieces in the work. The framing of the question is exactly right. When people talk about that there's a school to prison pipeline, that's actually not really accurate, because not every school has a pipeline to prison. There's a poverty to prison pipeline. There is this idea where we are in many ways defining the destiny of our children before they even have a chance to define it for themselves, before they even have a say. And so as we think about this, and from a collective work, and I echo so much of what Dia Gonzalez and also Erica was saying earlier, where this idea of saying, how do we address public safety? The thing we have to do to address public safety in our communities is first being able to address all the myriad of issues that's making our community feel unsafe in the first place. And part of that, and the first step of that, has to be a process where we all, each of one of us collectively, have to understand our own measure of complicity in that. That there's not one aspect or one segment of a society that frankly has failed on this. That for many of our children and for many of our communities, there's been a collective failure in a way of being able to be aggressive and imaginative about changing prospects for our families, and particularly the families where poverty is oftentimes incredibly predictable and incredibly generational. And so when I think about what that means, it means that we have to be diligent and we have to be aggressive when it comes to making sure that those, that we have law enforcement that's accountable and transparent. And it also means that we have to address the other issues that we know that are keeping and putting so many of our community in poverty, and frankly having an incredibly weighty impact of actually keeping them there. So whether it is rethinking the way we address public resources for our schools, whether we were rethinking available quality housing, and the fact that as long as you have housing insecurity and food insecurity and a lack of access to healthy food, you already know that your climb is going to be incredibly steep and incredibly unfortunate. Access to outdoor space for culturally responsive social services, for philanthropy that doesn't just see ourselves as coming in to save communities, and that philanthropy is that's actually going to work with communities and give community members not just a voice, but give them a vote. So really what it's going to be, and what we're going to have to see, is just a collective buildup and a coordinated buildup about how we're thinking about a variety of these various issues. And I think that when we're having that conversation, when we're having that build, when we're thinking about the correlation between poorer health outcomes and higher crime neighborhoods, again, statistics that continue to reinforce themselves with the data all the time. When we're seeing evidence of supporting the claim that healthy communities have less crime, but evidence suggesting that increased access to health care, like substance abuse treatment, for example, reduces crime. So we have to be able to be very assertive about understanding where the data continues to lead us, and then being able to put not just our capital and our resources, but frankly, our policy heft behind making sure that those things are reinforced and that those things are actually scalable. And so that's the holistic conversation that I think was spoken about both with Dia Gonzalez, with Erica, with everyone else on this panel, and the fact that there's not going to be one institution, nor lane, nor pillar that's responsible for creating a sense of public safety and a sense of public transparency in our community, because there's not one group, agency, lane that's been responsible for the lack of public safety that people have within our communities and we have within so many of our homes.
Thank you for that. And I love the breadth of this panel. So Commissioner Shea, you have been doing a lot of work, and we know that you're going to be delivering something, or the city will be delivering something April 1st to the governor. You've been thinking a lot about this issue. Tell us what NYPD under your leadership is doing, and what role it sees itself playing in creating safe communities.
Well, Carol, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And my one complaint is I've made this clear many times. I never want to follow Wes Moore in speaking. When you look at the report that was put out that you worked on, Carol, the 9 pillars, I think the panel really that was called together at such an important time nailed it perfectly. I don't think that you can look at any of those 9 recommendations, and I agree, the work really starts now. If you look at any of them and find anything to argue with. I would argue that the NYPD has been an agency that has been looking inward and reforming for a number of years. Certainly nothing prepared us or myself personally for what took place last year, and it is a different speed, if you will, with the reform package that you just mentioned. But as I listen to this conversation and I pull pieces out of everyone that's spoken, whether it's Erica talking about community engagement or Eric Gonzalez, my good friend, talking about, where we came from and where we are now and how we continue to have a need for the police and prosecutors. And Wes, I'm always impressed when I listen to Wes speak. I think Wes was 100% right. It's not about schools, it's about poverty. And it's about recognizing how the role the police plays in different neighborhoods, certainly here in New York City. One of those pillars talks about over-policing. And I wish I had the answer to that, Carol, because there's certainly a dire need for police in certain neighborhoods, but we have to be very careful about what that means and what that translates to and unintended consequences. And I think that we're doing that more than ever before, working with, and the key here is working with electeds, working with grassroots organizations, working with the most important people in this conversation, the people that actually live in the neighborhoods, working with prosecutors. And I think it's not a beginning and end, it's something that just continues to this day. So, I mean, I'm proud of the work that we've done thus far, but I'm also very much aware that this is an extremely complicated discussion that we're going to have today in terms of how do we get this right and how do we continue to adjust. And I think that's the right word. And I'll say just one last thing, Carol, because I don't want to be like my good friend Eric Gonzalez and filibuster. Transparency to me is a verb. And everyone speaks about transparency, but I would challenge everyone that we need transparency from all parts of this ecosystem and not just the police department. So when you talk about coming out of that report was, what money and resources go into certain communities. That's how we look at crime when we fight crime. What's going on in an area? What were the calls? Who are the people that live there? How do we fight the crime in that area? Well, we have to have the same sort of precision here with what resources go into a particular area. What is there for the kids to do? What are their community groups doing in that particular area? We know there's crime where there's poverty, and we know we want to help. It just cannot be the police alone. And I think we all agree on that is expected to handle a particular problem without all of us working really together. And I'll throw one thing for everyone to think about, because one of the other pillars was you should have an answer to where does the police get sent most often, right? That was one that was mentioned in the report at some point. Where are the locations that the police goes to over and over, and can we address it differently? Well, that comes back to the homeless and the mental illness piece. And I will tell you that the 10 locations in New York City, because we have this data. Wes and I share this data need. We both love data, and the key is what you do with it. But the 10 locations in New York City where we send police officers to most often to deal with calls for mental illness are shelters and locations where emotionally disturbed people are kept. And that kind of goes to a greater question that as we're having discussions about taking the police out of this, I'm left to ponder, why are we sending the police to those locations at all if we already have counselors there, trained mental health professionals? So the answer is, it's not as easy as everyone thinks. It's sometimes even the professionals that have the training are calling the police themselves. So I think these conversations are good. I think it's the conversations we need to have, but it's something that we're really all going to have to roll up our sleeves and have those difficult conversations. So thank you for having me on.
Thank you. And absolutely, this is just one of a series of difficult conversations and having the right people at the table. So Ms. Ford, if you were in charge, how would you use the heft of ABNY and the participants in this panel to help us get to a place where we think about where do we need to invest, how do we need to invest in order to support organizations like yours who want to be partners in creating public safety?
I'm glad to be in charge today. And then maybe I could be the commissioner for a day or something. But and I'm glad it goes after what Commissioner Shea just said about where they get distributed the most, right? Where the calls come in the most. I would get my dear friend Wes Moore to get philanthropy to invest in those communities where police get called the most, to help build self-determination, to help change mindsets, to help people heal from generational trauma. People have lived in a community. There was an article the other day where a lady lost 11 members of her family, right? And so if it's constant gun violence, constant police coming in with a mindset that there's crime, there's danger, there's fear. And so how do we shift the fear? You have to invest in putting more of us, right? More healers, more interrupters, more outreach workers who work the community, public health perspective, and help people transform and heal. When we talk about schools, that there's quality education. There's not detention and suspension and discipline. There's healers in those schools, working with people to transform, because if you're coming from a house where there's violence, or a block where there's violence, or consistent trauma and fear of a family, of a people, you have to at some point stop and heal. The other day, my employee got shot in Brooklyn. We're at he's immediately treated as a perp, as a criminal. I'm immediately treated as a perp, as a criminal. Because I have a higher mindset, right? I respond differently. But we have to invest, I'm talking to our investor right now, Wes Moore, a large sum of money in these 10 communities, right? To really work on police and community relationship, on working on the heart of these police that come into our community, who have no understanding of our culture, have no understanding of how we communicate, have no understanding of our historical trauma that we experience, that we pop off in a second, that we run from police because we've been stopped so many times, that we do things that you have no idea why we do them or what the impact is or relationship to you. It's not about you. It's about we both need to heal. And so I would work with Wes Moore to put enough money and resources into these communities. I would work with Gonzalez and other DAs to work on how we look at crime, how we look at the judges and the prosecutors, and how we are relating to people and what they did, and really showing up for those people, from a place of understanding and compassion. And then let's put them in a place where they wake up in the morning and they drink wheatgrass, they do yoga, they do meditation, they do group counseling and conversation, they're engaging in education and family counseling, and they're working on building whole people so that there truly is reform, there truly is recovery, there truly is rehabilitation, so that we're putting them in places that not only just lock them up like animals, and animals shouldn't even be locked up like that, but we're helping people become whole. I would work with ABNY and other institutions like John Jay to bring evaluators and businesses and developers into communities so that we can get the data that we need to track the true needs of the people, and then put the resources in there based on that. I would work with Commissioner Shea to work with the line police and really work with the line police, because we have great conversations up top, but it don't get down to the line police. And so we have to change behavioral norms. We have to do things different. We can't talk about reimagining. We got to implement reimagining. And that means working with Officer 1, Officer 2, Officer 3, Officer 4 on how they show up, on what they're doing, on what they internalize, on how they feel coming out to community every day after day after day, being them also being attacked, them also not being respected. That brings a certain, like, F you, I'm in charge. And it also brings pain. And so on both sides of this process, we have to heal, we have to transform. And so the main thing that I would do with everybody is come from a place of compassion, a place of true empathy, a true reimagining that we have the power to change our conditions and our lives. And I'll give everybody aloe and golden seal and all of oregano instead of vaccine now. But
All right, thank you, Ms. Ford. So Wes, I'm coming to you. So, you know, there is an important role for philanthropy. There's an important role for how we invest our tax dollars. There's an important role for nonprofits. There's an important role for the business community to invest and invest in the success of our young people and our communities. And I know that we often focus on the statistics, like the, you know, lowering suspensions, lowering detention, lowering the number of deaths and gunshots. But let's also talk about, how do we have the same measures of success that we want for our own kids? How many are graduating, going to college, getting jobs, so when you, if you were the czar of bringing everybody together who's got money to invest, what strategy, what approach would you recommend to them about how to collectively think about these kinds of investments? Because that's ABNY's role, is trying to think strategically across the city about how to improve. What would you do?
I would, and you know, the commissioner said something I think really important earlier, where he's talking about kind of the fact that we are collecting information, and the truth is we have more data and information than we have ever had before, right? We have data and information upon data information about where our communities are, about where the pain points are, about where the challenges are. The other thing that we have to be unafraid to do, though, is twofold. One is make sure we're continually thinking about how are we disaggregating the data and breaking it apart to really get at the answers we're looking for. The second thing is not be unafraid to actually act on it. And this becomes the important component. I think, you know, Erica brought up a good point about what becomes the individualized roles of all these various sectors. When we talk about disaggregation of the data, you know, you're absolutely right, you know, President Mason, where we know the impact of high school graduation, we know the impact of college graduation, we know the economic mobility measures that it actually provides to people. We also know, though, that when you look at the disaggregation of the data, that when you break it down by elements such as gender and race and all these other elements, that it gets much more complicated. Right, we know, and the data continues to show that, for example, that for a person with a college degree, they have an average lifetime earnings of around $1 million more than someone who does not have a college degree, until you disaggregate the data. And when you disaggregate the data, you see that for a Black college graduate, that they have the same earning potential as a white high school dropout. right? So the disaggregation of the data matters because it also shows how are we going to go and target our impacts and to think really hard and critically about where those investments need to be made to be able to create equal and equitable frames of opportunity. The second piece, though, is really thinking about how are we leveraging our levers to be able to trigger the larger levers, right? And you know, and I think about, you know, my friend Erica and her, you know, are talking about philanthropy, and you're absolutely right. You know, philanthropy needs to get in the game in a different type of way, and making sure that we're being hard and aggressive with our investments, thinking hard about the fact that for our traditional philanthropy, that the basic benchmark is, you know, that you'll give away 5% of your coffers during the process of the year. That's like the IRS requirement. But when we look at the challenges that we are facing, is that the right number? Is that really what we should be allocating towards community? And who determines what capital gets allocated and to whom? We also know this, that on average, there's around $700 billion every single year that'll go out towards philanthropy, right? And people say that's a massive number, $700 billion. And that is a very big number. But here's the reality of that $700 billion. About half of that goes to colleges and universities, right? Alma maters, oftentimes. It's the reason that Harvard University, for example, has a $30 billion endowment. Right. And so we've now taken 700, that has now dropped into 350. And people say, well, $350 billion is still a lot of money. Absolutely. It is a very real amount of money. Half of that goes to homes of worship and hospitals. So now it's no longer 350. Now you're down about 175 for everything else, for children, for seniors, for the environment, for pets, for poverty. And so the job of philanthropy is never going to be, well, philanthropy needs to come in and solve all of these various issues. There's not enough philanthropy in the world to be able to do that. You know, philanthropy is how can we put together the most effective capital, and that can be risk capital that can grow and that can scale and that can address all these other challenges, where you look at the, you know, FPWA's report that showed that, you know, 5 community districts in New York City with the highest poverty rates were also among the 10 community districts with the highest jail incarceration rates. Looking at the Brennan report that really just came out about conviction and imprisonment and lost earnings, and looking how that report showed that time in prison can reduce someone's lifetime earnings potential by more than half. Or nearly half of $1 million. And that's any form of touch with the system. We're not even talking long-term convictions, any touch with the system. And so I think about it in context of, you know, there's a quote that literally sits on my desk from Dr. King, where he says, you know, philanthropy is commendable, but the philanthropists can never forget the economic injustice that makes philanthropy necessary. And that's how I think we have to continue to approach these various measurements of, we all have an important role to play, but part of that role for all of us has got to be, what are we doing to pull the largest levers that we know are both putting people and keeping people in poverty oftentimes. And those are policies that have been oftentimes generational and incredibly inhumane when we're looking at the pathways for people to be able to move from one situation to another situation sustainably.
Thank you for that. I'm writing that quote down. So DA Gonzalez, your Justice 2020 initiative was designed to be a larger part of looking at this as a community issue of public safety. Talk to us a little bit about what Justice 2020 is and what you've seen as a result of that work.
Right. Justice 2020 is a safety plan for Brooklyn that's based on the concepts that we can be safer by prosecutors and police not emphasizing arrest and conviction as much as doing other things to deal with accountability issues, engaging our community members as true partners in public-led safety, dealing with the very violent drivers of crime that cause terror in communities and are responsible, the 1% of the population that's probably responsible for up to 80% of the crime in this city, at least the violent crime. And then doing the data and transparency work that Wes is talking about. It's it's a different approach to how a prosecutor will lead the issue of public safety, understanding that the responses are that we need in order to do this work. It has to be collaborative, and we have to trust community members like Erica Ford in saying she knows what her community needs in order to feel safe. And really, public safety is about the sense of being and feeling safe in your own neighborhoods. Obviously, there are data points that emphasize different, things that we have to work on. But places like Abney, and I wanted to jump in on this, have a really powerful voice in leading this city. The funding sources to our communities have to really be leveraged into the city budget in different ways. And I think that as we start to think about different ways to approach public safety, Abney can, with philanthropy, also take a look at an intertwined or braided approach to public funding of communities that can lead to a safer place. I mean, we're all talking about the same things. It's about the resources and services that communities need to engage in meaningful long-term public safety results. For me, it's pretty simple, and Wes talked very directly about this. It's really about economic and social mobility, helping communities move out of poverty, and really directed resources in the 5 or 6 precincts in Brooklyn, the 10 communities in the city that really could get investments and would really make a difference in the quality of life of residents, would see immediate returns in public safety. And that is where Abney can help lead. We're going to be electing a new mayor soon in this city, and Abney can play a role in helping shape that discussion in terms of what we want City Hall to do. We understand that when we ask the police to do a little less and to focus in on the drivers of crime, that in most neighborhoods, they're not going to be a solution immediately to a lot of the quality of life issues and other concerns where the police get called now. And so we can't expect the police to step away immediately without the fact of building those resources. And so this has to be a tiered process. And we, again, to, Erica, who's on here, there are already people on the ground that can start doing this work, and the funding that they're receiving is not sufficient. And we saw, at least in Brooklyn, I can speak very directly, during the pandemic, those organizations were kind of left in the wind. They weren't being paid. They weren't getting the resources. They weren't getting the things they need in order to sufficiently service the communities that they service. And so this is the kind of braided approach that I think Abney and philanthropy can play in the immediate future.
So this is a rich conversation that I knew wouldn't fit into an hour, but we had an hour. Commissioner Shea, you've heard a lot, and you've heard a lot about we're expecting and asking police to play a different role, one that NYPD has led on before in terms of being partners with the community and listening to the community. How do we equip the line officers to be able to play this different kind of role that we're asking them to play now in the community?
Well, I think training plays a large role in this, Carol. I know I have to be brief here. I would remind people that, just going back a year and a half, as much as we could always strive to be better, we had gotten to a place in New York City, Eric D.A. Gonzalez alluded to this earlier, that we had cut incarceration levels to really the lowest in the country for a major city, and cut crime. We had introduced neighborhood policing and begun the process of involving people in this work with the police more than we ever had in the past. We had invested, first thing I did when I became police commissioner is invested about 300 police officers. Their sole job to work with kids, and that was before COVID ever hit. So we had been on this path and far from perfect, and obviously still making mistakes. But again, I think that, what we could do, I just want to touch on one thing, and this may be a little controversial, but I don't think money money is certainly a big piece. And I think that our biggest challenge is, and we're all saying, I think, the same thing, of breaking that poverty pipeline and giving and lifting people up and giving them the chance. But I get real nervous too, whether you're talking about philanthropy or government, throwing money at a problem without holding those making decisions accountable and making sure they're transparent. And if you have 10 programs and you throw money at 10 programs and you re-up those 10 programs last year, I get real nervous, because the normal ebb and flow of life and businesses, some are going to succeed and thrive, and some are going to be a failure. We need to start asking hard questions about who are the failures and who is not providing transparency. Transparency can't just be for government organizations. It has to be across the board. And when we get together, all of us, and make those hard decisions, I don't think there's anything that can stop us, to be frank. There's no reason in the greatest city in the world that we can't take care of our kids and make sure every kid growing up, whether it's Bed-Stuy or the Upper East Side, has the same opportunities. And that goes for mentoring, that goes for tutoring, that goes for after-school activities, that goes for getting them into jobs. There's no reason we can't do it. So that'll be my final piece, Carol.
And I think that we'll have agreement on all of these points. So we've got just 2 minutes left.
I don't know if this is a process, but I just would like to say one thing on the question of money.
Well, I'm going to give you that opportunity because my lightning round last question is this. We know that because of the federal stimulus that was just passed, that billions of dollars are coming into New York City to address what has been the impacts shown of COVID. And we have an opportunity in New York City to address the long-term systemic inequities. I want each of you in 30 seconds, because we've got to get through 4 of you. What would you do? How would you say that money should be invested back in the community? So Erica, you go first.
So I would just say that, just even for 30 seconds, everything that Shay talked about costs money. And so with a $6 billion police budget, we have to even the playing field of the things going into community that help people heal. So I would invest in jobs. I would invest in building homes, building the community back up, putting things in the community that build economic wealth for the young people, programs like ours that hire the people from the community to keep the community safe, and just even the playing field of what people give people some of the funds that they need to build the businesses that they need to build to transfer their life thing. But I would just also say that from a perspective of how we transform poverty, you have to invest resources. You can't shift poverty just by hopes and prayers. We have to put resources into people to help change the conditions that exist right now.
Thank you, Ms. Ford. Mr. Moore, how are we going to invest this money to, as Ms. Ford challenged us, eradicate poverty in New York City?
I think we need to have a laser-like focus on one word, and that is, and the word actually that Ms. Ford touched on, and that's jobs. It's going to be job retraining. It's going to be reskilling. It's going to be how are we working with institutions of education all up and down the pipeline to be able to create pathways for students, individuals and their family members to have long-term sustainable employment. It has been said before, the fastest way to stop crime is to give a person employment opportunities. And so we've got to put a laser-like focus of using that capital into scaling programs that we see that are working, giving capital and birth and light to those that we think have the greatest potential of actually scaling on board, and being targeted about which neighborhoods and communities are going to be the ones to be the direct recipients. But we've got to focus on employment and good jobs.
Thank you. D.A. Gonzalez.
I agree with what was already said. I think, we need to focus on childhood poverty. We need to raise children in poverty out of poverty. And that needs to be our focus. And then doing the work that we've already discussed in making sure that we provide economic and social mobility for young people. I grew up in East New York. I grew up in one of the toughest neighborhoods in Brooklyn, the 7-5 precinct. People ask me all the time, how did I get to become the district attorney? How am I different than the other kids that grew up in East New York with me? The answer is I'm not. I just had a belief that it's just because I did well in school that my mobility structure was different. Grew up with a single mom. That, what it was for me and what it was for the people in my neighborhood that I saw become successful was simply that we had access to social mobility. And so getting children out of economic poverty and giving them that chance, whether it be education or employment, is the solution.
Commissioner Shea?
I think education and employment, you can't go wrong. And those are the pillars of really what will lift people up. And I think that as you talk about philanthropy and businesses and government and making sure the money, as Wes said, with laser-like efficiency gets to the people that really need it. I think we lean on, when you're talking about ABNY, we lean on the business community. I'm sure that somebody can be found that will donate time, or other businesses will get together and pay for a salary for somebody that can sit on top of this structure. And when the money is apportioned to whether it's job training or schools or social programs in communities, that it's actually spent on what it's supposed to, and that there's accountability that it's accomplishing what we hope it will. And if it's not, we pivot to something else. We have to be flexible here.
So I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank ABNY for giving us the opportunity to have this rich conversation. We know what the challenges are. We also know what work needs to be done. And I am confident that under the partnership of ABNY and the people who love so much New York and want to see our communities succeed, that we will be a model in New York City under the leadership of ABNY about how to use this money that's coming into New York City to address the systemic poverty, systemic racism, systemic inequities, and get it right so that we're not back here again in 50 years. So with that, I turn it back over to the Executive Director, Melva Miller, and Stephen Rubenstein. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, President Mason. That was for the depth of this conversation. And thank you to our panelists for this incredibly powerful conversation. Ms. Ford said we got to learn how to show up for each other. What was so powerful to me is all our panelists basically said that from their own perspective, that this is about showing up with compassion and wisdom and honesty and understanding and resources. And I'm going to say one thing about ABNY. We are proud that our CEO, Melva Miller, has had a life of showing up. Over to you, Melva.
That is very kind. Thank you so much, everyone, the audience, for joining us today. I want to really, from the bottom of my heart, thank this esteemed panelist. Like Stephen said, everyone showed up today and really brought a unique perspective to the work that needs to be done around the future of public safety for our city, the city that we care so much about. I want to thank John Jay College and Noble for putting together this report. If you look in the chat for the audience members, please download the report. It was done extraordinarily. And I encourage you all to read it. Carol, President Mason, I am so proud to be a John Jay alumni. You rock. Thank you for all that you did today to facilitate this discussion in such a precise way. I also want to thank you for creating the space and the path for ABNY and our members to move this conversation forward. You put us to task, and I love it. That's what we do best. We step up at ABNY in a time of need, and we are ready to work with everyone, not only on this panel, but on this call, to make sure that the city that we love remains safe. And for all of our audience members, right? We have a call to action, right? It was discussed today. We are looking for the next step, the next generation of this conversation, and to working with all of you to make sure that New York City is a safe place to live, work, and visit. Thank you all so much.
And we're in great hands with this John Jay grad, Melva Miller. I had to say that. Thank you.
Thank you all.